section when they were talking about the acquisition from Nippon, where there was a lot of contention between like workers and owners and the differing opinions. And within this section, it kind of talked about this Japanese company and how they were going to take this transition from like coke power to hydrogen power to fuel those blast furnaces. And this kind of showed the value of collaborating with other cities, especially those more modern, to kind of advance a city that's behind. And then it also talked about that high research spending by that company. And they said how the U.S. doesn't really have any spending near it, and how we're kind of short-term thinkers. And it was interesting to kind of think about how we kind of different from other countries in that way. So the second video was An American in the Making. And this one was mentioned before. It was just kind of a short form video that was made to kind of sell this U.S. Steel as a path to the American dream. And it just kind of opened with a couple talking to their son, and they had received a letter that I believe translated to "I'm sending money, be careful and come right away," which was from his brother. And so he basically just packs his bags eagerly and heads out across the country to first New York and then to Gary. And it talks about kind of his job within the plants and how he lives and how his life kind of progresses there. And I thought it was interesting how he'd arrived in New York and then traveled to Gary, because the prior article had kind of talked about the connection between those two cities. And then it was interesting that it displayed the different tools in production and kind of puts into perspective the technological advancement that we've kind of experienced over time. The next article was What is a City, and in city words, that whole text. It kind of just talks about what defines a city and asks the reader to envision what comes to mind, which I thought was a really fun prompt because me personally, I kind of envisioned Chicago when they had said that because I'm most familiar with it, but it was interesting to think of how other people would envision that idea. And some interesting points was in defining a city and thinking about how it differs from like one person to the next, kind of how like I would define a city versus how you would define it, and how our experiences kind of write that idea or concept within our mind. And then also the idea that there are conflicts and experiences shared between the farmland and the city, but it's kind of the city's proximity within the people, or the people within it, that kind of amplifies those experiences to a different level. And then also, I'll touch on it later because I do touch on Mumford's text, but it was really interesting, kind of how he talked about urban sprawl and spreading of the city population, and kind of how that like inevitable dissipation of its humanity and creativity, because people are being disconnected from one another. And so he also kind of talks about that compression of people within a city and how that amplifies creativity. The next idea was the cities of the American dream in the Sphinx in the city. So here, Carrie, part that was interesting was Carrie kind of talking about her struggle to find existence, first when she was in Chicago and then in New York, and how you kind of have to become a spectacle to feel present within the moment. Kind of her desire for the prerequisites of visibility and existence itself. I think it was interesting kind of talking about the separation of classes and lifestyles within the city, and how there's like kind of a gap or inability to function or flourish if you're not kind of living that picturesque, ideal kind of fairy tale lifestyle. Another area that was really interesting was the talk of the bohemian lifestyle, that it kind of impacted these women specifically, and how it kind of brought further difficulties. Not only did it like introduce the positives of like increased self-expression and freedom and arts, but how if the question of it, is it kind of like a failure, or that a man can kind of like come through and pick out his wife, but that same option didn't exist for a female bohemian, so she kind of has to settle with a man who was her intellectual inferior. So I think that area was really interesting. Another text was The Ever-Present and Future, All That Matters. This was really interesting because it kind of talks about how we feel helpless about like our long-term future, unlike our past, which we can like kind of see, and it's kind of being able to observe and study the past, but not being able to do that about the future. I think that was kind of like interesting to hear about the root of kind of how like that's kind of how we fear the future. And this also connected to the past reading I had done for my kind of intro warm up was reading about the Enchanted World and how it talks on the predictability of technology and code, and kind of our focus on advancement in AI and how we try to kind of harness the unknown and make it understandable like somehow. The next text is the alternative futures at the Manoa School. It had these steps where it was appreciating the past, understanding the present, forecasting aspects of the future, experiencing alternative futures, envisioning them and creating them, and then institutionalizing them. Within this, I kind of felt like there should be a stage of more understanding the past, and understanding it's kind of important to not repeat past mistakes and continue negative cycles. And then the third discipline society view was one that really resonated with me, as it kind of talked about a good blend of acknowledging the role of economic growth, but then also not placing as much emphasis on that. The Vintage Tomorrows video by Brian David Johnson was probably my favorite of this bunch. It talks about the science fiction and its kind of role in his upbringing, and it prompted me to think about the role of fiction in expanding our creativity as humans and kind of our curiosity, and how it's impacted the growth of our planet and our societies. So yeah, he just kind of touches on the idea that like science and tech are only constrained by our imaginations, and it made me think of like, what would a world without curiosity and belief through fiction be like? And without this language, will we think about the future as much or imagine ourselves in this future without it? And then the two additional texts that I looked into was Mumford's What is a City and the City Reader, which I kind of talked about before, but he began with a statement that was really impactful, which was most of our housing and city planning has been handicapped because those who have undertaken the work have no dear notion of the social functions of the city. This kind of impacted me because it made me think of kind of infrastructure and intentional planning, and how like the focus on a site's construction can impact its role in relationships with both the humans and animals that it'll eventually interact with, and kind of like fully understanding a site and its past, so you're not just completely rewriting the site but kind of reintegrating it into this kind of like modern view. And the idea that like kind of a city fosters art and is art, and it creates theater and is theater. The idea of kind of the city is itself, and the city and people both shape each other equally. And then finally, I read The Man Who Created London. I think this is really interesting because it kind of touches on the efficiency of Abercrombie's plan, and despite it being so dated, with a lot of its impacts still being seen today within Paris. And then it also talked kind of about the increasing population growth and the lack of housing that were kind of modern issues that they were facing that kind of didn't associate or assimilate with that Abercrombie plan. And it was interesting to hear that, because I know that's definitely not only a concern within Paris, but also in different cities across the world, like New York City here, for example. And I think finally it was interesting that it acknowledged the issues connected to Abercrombie's planning type in terms of like fragmentation and separation of communities, and how it kind of attributes all the success to one name, opposed to acknowledging and encouraging group work and collaboration.